Hello, everyone. I am here with Professor Eric Anderson.
Hello.
He is a Masculinities professor in what university is it?
University of Winchester in the United Kingdom.
So you are a resident of the United Kingdom, but
Yes.
from America.
That's
you
correct.
don't have the accent. So,
Yes.
But you're not your typical Masculinities professor. You tell everybody who's here that may not know, because they probably won't see the video until after ours goes up, a little bit about what it is that you do.
Right, so I am a professor of masculinity, and principally what I do is I chart the impact that decreasing cultural homophobia has on the lives of men, particularly millennial men. And that research, that data-driven research, has led me to move away from a feminist position in the study of masculinities. Many of your readers will probably, listeners.
Yeah, listeners, viewers, yeah.
Will probably have heard of Michael Messner and Michael Kimmel. They're sort of well-known, right, masculinity scholars. And Messner was my PhD advisor, and Kimmel was my postdoc advisor. So I was trained, and perhaps you could even use the word indoctrinated, into a pro-feminist ideology that I started to work my way out of pretty quickly. But what really brought me out of it was the data about men didn't match the horrors that masculinity scholars were suggesting men were. There was a great deal of data collected on men in the 1980s and early 1990s, which showed that they were very homophobic and very aggressive and sort of valued what I call an orthodox aspect to masculinity. But times have changed, and men have changed, and that research hasn't. My research has kept pace, but for example, the research of Messner has not. So I've kind of come out the other side. There will be a very large number of masculinity scholars that will be horrified, incensed that I even showed my face at an MRA conference. And you can probably ask me questions about that, and I'm sure your listeners will want to know why I'm here and all of that.
They would. Yes. Okay, so first of all, what we're talking about is that Messner's data,
yes,
and like a lot of other masculinity professors, they were still working with sort of old data.
Very
so they
old.
hadn't done any new studies, or
Messner's data on Messner's data on athletes. What Messner did was he applied concepts of masculinity to athletes. And the data he collected for his PhD was in the late 70s, early 80s, that era. And he has reused that data, and he has not collected new data on jocks since. He has done a little bit of research on his kids' own baseball teams, it was. But those kids are off in university now. So, that data is 10, 15 years old. And he's just not updated his repertoire of what's out there. In fact, he denies that the data that I and dozens of my colleagues come up with showing the changing nature of masculinities pretty much so denies that it exists. He just sort of blanks it out. He doesn't want to know it exists. I think he's wedded to a project of believing that men have to be horrible, and that's what he made his case on. You could kind of understand it from his perspective. He's made his name saying that sports were at the center of the production of masculinity. And I've come along and said, actually, today's research shows that team sport athletes are leading the way in becoming softer, gentler, nicer, more emotional men. What that means is his body of work is now irrelevant. And who wants to be told that their work is irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
So you can see his vested interest in keeping the status quo. But the field has moved on. He's lost that. Everybody knows that change is incontrovertible. Even Michael Kimmel, who resisted for quite a while, says, Eric, you're absolutely right. Cultural homophobia has decreased dramatically, and it's had significant impact on softening men and making men more like feminists have called for them to be.
Okay. A bit about this cultural homophobia. How was it measured? Like, how do they conduct the study? I know that we have people that watch us that are like involved with sociology. They have a vested interest. One of the people I like to do shows with, she is actually a teacher's assistant in that field. So
right.
How did you guys know? Like, how did you measure this homophobia and back in the 80s? And
yes.
How's it changed?
So what we have is longitudinal, long-term studies, and they ask the same questions. Granted, these questions are horrific. They're really bad questions. For example, one of them is homosexuality always wrong, sometimes wrong, occasionally wrong, or never wrong, right? Where's the other side of the equation? Always right,
Yeah,
And
yeah.
for who? For you? you might be incredibly gay friendly, but for you, homosexuality is wrong, right? Because you're not
yeah,
gay,
it's
right?
a tricky
So it's a
question.
stupid question. It's a ridiculous question. But the value of the question is it's the same stupid question, but it's been asked of the same demographic population year after year since 1973 in the United States with the General Social Survey data, and since 1978, I believe, with the British Survey of Social Attitudes. Compatriot questions, two different cultures, asked yearly or almost yearly up until the present day. So what we're able to do is, however people are interpreting those questions, we can clearly identify that in the late 1970s, mid to late 1970s, when they started this data, attitudes towards homosexuality were better and got significantly worse in the mid-1980s. And that was a direct response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, right? And it was also a response to Reagan and his version of hypermasculinity, and Thatcher and the Christian right wedding themselves to Republican politics, and homosexuality becoming the whipping boy of the Christian right. And so antipathy towards gays rose dramatically to the point at which 87% of the American population said in 1988 that homosexuality is always wrong. Okay, so that's a culture of absolute oppression, right? But in 1992, Bill Clinton ran for office wearing a gay pride necklace and playing the saxophone on Saturday Night Live. And this began to change the public discourse because he was talking about allowing gays to serve in the U.S. military, which was strategic because that highlighted that men were already in the military, which meant gay men could also be masculine, right? And so it started to sort of trouble this idea about gay men not being able to be masculine. And what we show from that longitudinal data is cultural homophobia has decreased yearly with a slight blip when George Bush was running for re-election, but it has gone down, 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 down. And remarkably, whereas cultural attitudes towards things like race usually work through what we call cultural replacement, youth grow up with a better attitude and the old people die. On issues of homosexuality, both older people are changing their mind, and of course youth are coming up without homophobia. It is absolutely incontrovertible, highlighted by multiple other studies, that for millennial youth, where it used to be that youth stigmatized homosexuality, today homophobia is highly stigmatized amongst millennial youth. They have no cultural palette, no room for homophobia in their lives. So it's very robust data in that capacity.
All right. And this studies, was this only for homosexual men, or was this also, or was it just in general, or?
Yeah, it isn't supposed to be, but it is, because homosexuality, when they asked the question at first, was thought to be a male domain.
Yeah.
Right, and people associate homosexuality with men the foremost. But we can measure this in other ways too, like support for same-sex marriage.
Sure.
Right. When I was fighting for it in 1998, I believe it was about 30% of the population supported it, and now we're up to 72% of the American population supporting same-sex marriage. So that's incontrovertible, right? And so it highlights that this culture, we won the culture wars. The Christian right has lost the culture wars. The progressives have won the culture wars.
Oh, absolutely.
Progressives by that day's standards.
at that time.
Progressive today means something different than a progressive did in the 1990s, right?
Sure. And even when you were talking about that, how things went down like in the Clinton years, and there was like a blip in the Bush years. Even that blip was probably significantly lower than when things were in the 80s, right?
It's like the stock market.
It was like a tiny thing, right? So in general, we've all moved forward tremendously
at a rate that is unbelievably impressive.
Yeah.
Like compared to any other social issue, compared to women's rights to vote or abortion or racism or whatever, this has been phenomenal progress.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I saw a change in my lifetime, and I'm only in my 40s. So.
Yeah, you're in your 40s?
Yeah, I'm 45.
Go you. Shit. Damn. What cream do you use?
Okay, so coming back to your talk that you did, there was I know this was like it seemed to me that after you did this, it was like the point of contention for everyone was this, you were measuring male opinions of their own, I guess, masculinity over time. Is that I don't want to misrepresent.
No, I was measuring, so for the audience, what they should know is YouGov has done this, and I've done this as well. We administer a questionnaire to males in one snapshot of time, right? So this is not longitudinal study, asking them to rate their masculinity on a scale from completely masculine, mostly masculine, more masculine than feminine, all the way to the other side of exclusively feminine, right? So scale of 1 to 7. And, but the variance is we break out the data by different cohorts. So 65-year-old men, we put it into one cohort and we analyze that data, and then other cohorts.
It's kind of like measuring a generation.
So that's exactly what it is. We're measuring generational attitudes towards masculinity, and the data shows, you won't be able to see this as radio, but this huge shift where all of the men who are 65 and older say, I'm generalizing here, but all of the men say that they are totally 100% masculine. But when you got down to the data on the 19-year-olds, quite literally the mode and probably the mean is, no, actually, the mode for certain is more masculine than feminine, with equal numbers falling on both sides, one saying more feminine than masculine. And I suspect, as Mike Buchanan warned me, that there are people in that audience, and I'm not maligning them for this view, who believe that traditional masculinity has some tremendous value, that it has some good, and that data won't sit well with them, that they don't want to know that that is what's happening, so they become hyper, like, that question, they don't want to believe that the shift is occurring. But this shift is absolutely occurring. You have to be blind not to see this shift.
Okay. I have a question about the shift,
Please.
though. Something I was thinking about. Because we're asking, and these are college students? Or they're just regular guys?
I do college students up to 90.
Right, up to really old people.
Yeah.
But the younger generation.
Insulting.
I know. Seniors.
There you go.
are more experienced betters. Okay, so anyway, but like the younger folks are, like the millennials, millennial men, and then are there Generation Z men? I know that's
I'm kind of guilty of this. I started calling them millennial men probably 8 years ago, and I'm not even sure if they're still millennial men, but so I just say, youth. How's that?
Yeah,
University-aged
sure.
youth.
Well, here's the thing. There was the thing I was wondering about, and I don't know if maybe you've already considered this or whatever, but could it be possible if a man is being self-interviewed about his, let's say, measure of his masculinity, if he is in a culture that is constantly slamming masculinity and calling it the root of all evil, then if you ask him how masculine are you, is it possible that they could sort of scale back their masculinity for those reasons? And I'm not saying
absolutely
that because so it could in fact have a little effect on those numbers.
It could, but the realities of men's life is so bared out by dozens and dozens and dozens of other types of studies that I do that it is absolutely incontrovertible.
Sure.
So, for example, if you look at YouTube, right? You look at the most famous YouTube authors in the United Kingdom. It's 2 of them are gay. One of them is everybody thinks is gay, and and YouTube, of course, is a domain for young men. And this generation is just not interested in masculinity. They're not interested in homophobia. Team sport participation is dropping tremendously because boys don't feel that they need to go to this environment to socially prove their masculinity. Aggression is dropping. Smoking is dropping. Get this. Youth today report having less sexual intercourse, heterosexual use, than youth of previous generations. So they are just softening at a tremendous rate as, look at me, I'm wearing skinny jeans, right? I got this style, not from gay men, but from all the straight guys in my class who are wearing jeans that look like they're painted onto their bodies, right? And and then the trousers that come down to there and the no socks thing, and you're just like, that looks so gay. And they don't care. And then as they cease to not care, it becomes not gay. And that's what's beautiful about this generation, is they don't care. And so things cease to lose their codification into gay and straight.
Now, I noticed, and maybe this is an accident or whatever, but you said they don't care about masculinity, they don't care about homophobia. Do you think that masculinity, this I guess the archetypal masculinity that you're using to measure, is there a correlation between that and homophobia?
Yes. Homophobia drives masculinity. Absolutely. So imagine 3 cultural sets, okay? But it's not, this is going to get slightly confusing, so I'm going to try to describe it in the most simplest terms. But the reality is, it is not just homophobia that drives gender. It is a culture's willingness to believe that homosexuals exist in their culture, in their families, in their churches, in their communities, neighborhoods, right? So imagine a culture like America, 1700s. They know maybe that this homosexuality thing may exist. They've heard about it from Greek and Roman times. But they don't know anybody around them that's gay. and they don't readily believe that anybody in their life can be gay. And because you don't believe that, men can do like Abraham Lincoln did, which is sleep in the same bed with his best friend for 7 years, even as a statesman, right? And that's not homosexualized. And nobody thinks, oh, Abraham Lincoln must be gay because he's sleeping in a small bed with another man for 7 years. Then enter the awareness of homosexuality, which really began with the trials of Oscar Wilde in 1895 in Reading, England, increased with Kinsey's study in 1942, and then the Stonewall riots, and hit an apex of 100% cultural awareness with HIV/AIDS in the West. Now what you have is awareness that homosexuality exists in your community, and the same antipathy towards homosexuality as you had in the 1700s, but now we believe that it could be any of us. So here's the deal. I don't know your sexuality. Gay, straight, bi?
I'm straight.
I don't believe it. No, I don't.
Okay.
So how do you prove you're straight?
I mean, personally, I wouldn't bother to try.
You don't give a shit.
Yeah.
But in the 1980s, you would have. Because if you took that disposition in the 1980s, people would have said, well, you must be gay. And you had your ass kicked, right? So the one thing that heterosexual men cannot do is socially prove that they're straight. You can prove it for a moment, but then their suspicion can come upon you again. And a whole lifetime of heterosexual perception can be outdone by a limperistic handshake or too tight trousers or going, ooh, or right, anything. People go, he might be gay. Because we believe that 1 in 10 of us must be gay, so somebody in this room has got to be gay, and he acted a little too feminine, boom. So out of fear of being thought gay, men become more orthodox in their gendered perspectives. They become more hyper macho. They become more emotionally stoic. They don't touch other men. They espouse antipathy towards homosexuality, and that's how they socially prove to their friends that they're gay.
One other thing. Okay, so I guess I'm assuming you have a focus on masculinities, and that means boys and men.
Yes.
But what part do you think, if you maybe you know, do women have to play in this whole schema? Like, I would assume that they are, like this whole thing about what does it mean to be masculine? How masculine are you? I think that women have a large part to play in sort of like reinforcing that. So it's not just men making this decision, but I think that, when they say, oh, I'm 100% masculine, like I'm all this, I think part of it is to do with, I want to attract women, I have to be this way, and this is what women like. And women are saying, well, that's what I want a man. So like when men, as millennial men, are now sort of like swimming around in the middle, or maybe, slightly more masculine and feminine or whatever, what do girls think of that? Like, like what are they becoming like less feminine too? Like, are we sort of meeting in the middle somewhere, or?
So there's a really good question about what's happening to women's gender that I won't get into. But I will tell you that, and I don't mean to all women or any capacity, but that the shift of men from masculine to sort of,
in
softer,
the middle somewhere, softer, I guess,
is resisted by women more than it is resisted by men. And I find that in my research, I find that in quantitative research, that women still want this guy who's going to change the car tire and take care of them and all that, and that they're resisting it more. I'll just give you a classic example. I hate cherry-picked examples, but it is supported by quantitative data, so I'll make the exception for this cherry-picked example. I remember being in essentially what's called a sixth form. It's like a high school. And I remember just watching these two boys. They were laying on the grass. One was lying with his head on the other boy's stomach, looking up at the sun, chatting. This might sound strange to American listeners, but to the British, they'll be like, yes, of course, right? This is what boys do. And so these two boys were just lying, enjoying each other's physicality and having this conversation. And this girl walks by and she goes, oh my God, you guys look gay. And the boy's responses was nothing. And she said, don't you guys even care? And the boy's responses were nothing. And so this is a cherry-picked example of women policing men's gendered perspectives.
Sure.
Men have done a good job of not caring what the women think, and more evidence comes from that through the bromance. In my research on bromances, I find that 50% of men say that they enjoy their emotional relationship with the guy. As I don't say more. I don't ask them that question. I say as much or more, and then they say yes. Okay? And they say because they're more at ease around guys. One of the things I hear over and over again is, you can have an argument with your bromance and he'll forgive you 5 minutes later. You can have an argument with your girlfriend and she'll bring it up 5 months later, right? So there's this ease of men being around each other that men are really enjoying. And I think it's going to have serious impacts on culture. I think these are all good impacts. It's delaying age of marriage. It's making MGTOW more acceptable. It's making singledom more acceptable. And as the availability of sex with women has become less stigmatized, men can have their sexual needs and then have their emotional needs met with men. And so it's complicating what it means to be gay, straight, and all of that anyhow, because the guys I interview are saying, well, wait a minute, if emotional desire is part of sexuality, then yeah, I have no desire to have sex with guys, but I'd much rather hang around and be with my guy friends, and I have this intimacy with them. And is that sort of like a sexuality kind of thing? Right? So they're complicating it.
One other thing, you mentioned parents, so that was something else I wanted to bring up.
Yeah.
What if, could the fact that we have a growing number of men being raised without fathers have an impact on this phenomenon that you're talking about?
I don't believe. I am not convinced in the slightest by Warren Fell's argument, by Paul Elam's argument on these whatsoever. And I mean no disrespect to them, but they tend to look at the micro and they tend to take things from a psychological perspective. And Paul Elam, everything he does is psychological. And I think a lot of it is just absolutely not data driven. So if we expected to see huge shifts in men committing crimes, for example, because of the lack of a father, then I would expect that the boys who grow up after World War I and after World War II, you would see these huge spikes in criminality. And we don't. After the Vietnam War, and we don't. If you expected, for example, some have theorized that homosexuality is a product of the absent father. Well, nowhere in America today is the absent father more present than in the African American community. But we don't see elevated rates. We don't see tenfold or fivefold. We don't see any elevated rates of homosexuality amongst Black Americans. So I'm not buying all of this absence of the father figure stuff. And I think a lot of what they do is they forget that all the research on parenting shows what really counts is two parents. Mm-hmm. And that's because of presence and money, right? And when you move to one parent, you have a lot less money and a lot less presence. But most of the people who are one parents are women. So the tertiary variable here becomes, oh, well, look what happens to these men when their fathers aren't present. And my argument is, no, look what happens to these boys. I'm sorry, look what happened to these boys when their fathers aren't present. My argument is, no, look what happens to these boys when they've got one parent and less than half the income that they normally have, because usually it's a woman and they make less money. So income and presence is what counts in my perspective. Now, I'm open to being proven wrong. But from what I've read from Warren Farrell's new book, I don't buy this in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. I guess I wouldn't have thought about it in terms of it creating an increase in homosexually per se.
That used to be a theory.
Yeah, no.
And nobody believes that anymore.
No, I was thinking more about general, because to get into a little bit, because when, especially in the Black community, which I live in Chicago,
yep.
and the neighborhood I live in is predominantly Black and Hispanic, there is a epidemic of single mothers. And
Absolutely.
Of course, it could just as easily have been single fathers, but it just so happens that most of the time, the women are the ones that end up with custody, either because the fathers lose custody or they don't want to be around.
Lack of interest.
They just disappear, right? And so the children, they end up more likely to live in poverty. They end up more likely to not spend a lot of time with their mother also, and they
Yes.
don't even know who their father is.
Yes.
And they're more likely to be spanked by their mother because
she doesn't know how to handle it.
She's trying to do the
At her
job of
wit's
two
end.
people
Absolutely.
by herself, and it's just too much.
Sure.
And it's very common in the Hispanic community as well.
Yeah.
And so as a result of that, the boys tend to seek out something like a father. In their real life, they usually end up getting raised by peers. And
Yes.
the women, or the girls, they actually hit puberty a little earlier because they're also looking to replace the man, and neither of them know what a healthy relationship looks like, and so the cycle continues. And
I'll buy that, but that, again, that's about poverty and
lack
but
of
parental
it's
absence,
it's a combination of factors. But I guess what I was thinking was the reason why I brought it up was not necessarily because I thought that this could cause homosexuality, but rather could this be the result of could this result in the softer view of masculinity itself? Because if you're raised by your mom, then maybe you're not getting, you're not around as much of the hypermasculine, I guess.
Yeah.
Unless, because I know that they say that boys that are running around in gangs are trying to compensate, and they behave in a hypermasculine way by being violent, etc. But I don't necessarily buy that being violent and trying to constantly assert dominance over people is necessarily a masculine trait. I think that it's something that boys can do more effectively because they have the physicality to do so, but I think that they usually respond in an emotionally stunted way, because in many ways they're not
So this issue in the African American community, particularly in the United States, this is not new. How long has this been going on for? The
Since the 60s?
Right. So then if the production of softer masculinities was related to that, then the black male community should have moved to be softer sooner than the whites. But blacks have lagged behind whites in that capacity. And part of that is because of hyper-religiosity. Part of that is because of proving your own manhood. Part of that is because of gang culture, all of that sort of stuff, right? So I think that absolutely soundly proves that it isn't this absence of the father which is making boys softer. In fact, we believe that in the 1900s. That's an old belief system. I think it has absolutely everything to do with attitudes towards homosexuality. And the black community in America, particularly after Obama came out for gay marriage, has really caught up to, and I don't know if it's exactly equal, but if they haven't caught up, they're catching up quite quickly to the white community in terms of their attitudes towards homosexuality. And I think that's having a positive impact on the softening of black masculinities in the United States. Now, I do show in some of my research here in the United Kingdom that when I do find homophobia amongst youth, and it is incredibly, 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 incredibly rare, but when I do find it, it is most often amongst black youth. And that is because, I believe, because their parents have come from a culture, it's not...
There's still some remnants of that.
There's still some remnants of that. I was actually physically assalted by a black youth the other day, but I'm not trying to say that all black youth are homophobic in any capacity. But my research absolutely bears it out. What's interesting about that is they struggle because the white youth around them don't agree with their perspectives on homophobia. So they're not made cool by it. So what they're really finding themselves is in dissonance between what their parents are saying and what their peers are saying. And I believe that as they get a bit older,
it's going to change.
It's going to change.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know if there's any other questions.
Well, ask. You can ask the two sitting on the couch.
I know Allison's burning. Do you want me to just close it out, or do you want me to ask him a question?
Yeah, ask any question.